If you stick around to the end of this video, I'm going to show you exactly what to do with the last NBME results you have. That is the last self-assessment you wrote, how to interpret those results. I'm going to take you through 3 NBME results, and the last one is going to be one I wrote myself back in December. And I'm going to show you what you should actually be paying attention to and what you can safely ignore as you go through those results, so that you improve your performance quickly in preparation for the USMLE exams. Without wasting any much time, let's jump right into the first NBME. All right, so here's the first NBME we are going to be looking at. The first thing we look at is the score. The score is 179. I'll tell you from the onset, if you're scoring less than 150 on the NBMEs or even 160s, you have a challenge that we really need to address, right? You have a challenge that we really need to address, especially if you've been studying for a very long time and you're getting scores like 150, 160 on the exam. Leave a comment below, send me a message on Instagram, and I will tell you what you need to do. Or better still, you can book a consultation and let's address the problem you are having. Now, straight into this, you look at your scores. Scores are no more as important today, but then if you're writing self-assessments, you need to pass the self-assessments before you can pass the USMLE. So the score sort of still matters for people preparing for the exam. The first thing you want to look at, or the first thing the NBME addresses, is this performance area. This result is slightly different from your regular NBME results, and this is because this is actually a school NBME result. When you write NBMEs with your school, you're getting a result that looks sort of like this. And since some of you will be writing NBMEs with your school, I've decided to include this result. The other two we are going to be looking at will be your traditional NBME feedback, right? All right, applying foundational concepts. The first thing you notice is that there are 2 bars here that we need to consider. Here and this. This first bar is your performance. This is you relative to yourself. This is how your understanding of everything is interpreted for you personally. And this is how you compare to every medical student that is writing the NBME. It's easy to look at this. If you look at this student, for example, applying foundational science concepts is just there. It doesn't mean anything. Once they put it same, it doesn't mean much. But her diagnosis is high or was high. So this result is telling her that you can actually make diagnosis. You don't have much problem, at least compared to yourself, making diagnosis or reaching the diagnosis. But you're unable to apply foundational concepts. This is comparing you to yourself. However, compared to the group of students everywhere that wrote NBME, you are actually performing poorly in both areas. So sometimes, even if your diagnostic skills is much higher than your ability to apply concepts, it could be that altogether, compared to everybody else, you are still not even there. So although this is high for this student, it is still low when you compare her to the group. Simple interpretation, everything here is very poor. Everything here is very poor and needs work. We move on to where they actually give you performance by system. And then we are going to begin to look at the percentages and how they matter to you, what you can do about them. What areas do you need to focus on before you write the next NBME? What do you need to do? What do you need to do? That's a very important question for everybody to address. First, same. What this means is that with your general principles, behavioral health and special sciences, respiratory, all of these systems are basically, you have about the same strength level in each of those systems. Especially if your score is low, that is what it means. You have about the same strength level in each of them. For this student especially, respiratory system is better than every other organ system. That's the meaning of this, right? Your respiratory system is much better than everybody else. But that is not too important to us. What we are asking is, how does this respiratory system compare to the group? Even though respiratory system is higher than every other organ system, look at this. It is still low compared to everybody else that writes the NBME. So you begin to ask yourself, am I supposed to work on respiratory system? Yes, you should. Because if your respiratory system is high for you as a person and low in comparison to the group, it means your respiratory system is bad. It just means that it's not as bad as everything else, right? For this specific result, this respiratory system is just not as bad as everything else, but it is bad because it is poor here. But look at gastrointestinal system. Gastrointestinal system is high, and fair enough, it's average when you compare yourself to every other student writing the NBME. So what does this tell you? Your gastrointestinal system, for this student, I would say, good. You've done a good job with GI, right? So GI is probably not something she needs to emphasize, or GI is not something she needs to spend all her time reviewing. Now, how does she know what to study? This student has, say, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks to exam. Do you need to study everything here in preparation for your exam? Do you need to do that? That's the question. And how do you make the decision on which systems to study and what systems not to study? That's what we are going to address right now. General principles. Everything you are going to be doing on the NBME is general principles. Everything you're going to be doing on the NBME is general principles. The application of concepts, this right here, is general principles, because many students don't know, how am I supposed to improve my application of foundational science concepts? You learn the foundational concepts. When you learn the concepts, then you can think of applying those concepts. I would say that if you're going to try to improve your foundational concepts, for example, you're looking at subjects like general pathology, you're looking at subjects like general pharmacology, you're thinking of immunology, not so much biochemistry. I wouldn't stress biochemistry as much at this point. General pathology, general pharmacology, immunology. If you fix these three systems and you understand what you're talking about and what they are talking about, you are going to begin to recognize them in every other organ system. A few days ago, I was discussing myocardial infarction with someone, and he was talking about the evolution of MI. We're basically discussing the evolution of myocardial infarction. And he was talking about, oh, do you know, I realized that when there's infarction and then after 3 days, you have neutrophils in abundance and then macrophages begin to come in. And I said, do you actually realize that that is just acute inflammation playing out? First, there is necrosis. That's the infarction. And then what happens? When there's necrosis, if you have acute inflammation, neutrophils are going to begin to come in, right? Neutrophils are going to begin to come in. And by the third day, you have abundant neutrophils, macrophages begin to come in. And then after a few weeks, you have chronic inflammation, lymphocytes begin to come in. If you think of this, you will notice that this is exactly the same steps that go on in people with myocardial infarction. After you have myocardial infarction, a few hours, your neutrophils begin to come in. If neutrophils come in, enough neutrophils come in, it looks what? Yellowish. The heart begins to appear yellowish. Acute inflammation, right? We can extrapolate from here. If you don't understand general principles, when you get to a subject like cardiovascular system, you're going to be memorizing all of those things instead of simply understanding what they're talking about. These exams are much easier than a lot of people think. They are way easier than you actually perceive. The problem is you have ignored this part. I used to speak to a student a long time ago, and his scores plateaued. Basically, he was scoring 70, 71, 69 on NBMEs. And he said, what do you think I need to do? I said, you need to go back and study general pathology. He did not do that, and his USMLE suffered for that single reason. If you don't fix general principles, these three subjects especially, you can add microbiology there if you want to, you can add biochemistry, but I wouldn't stress them too much. But if these three subjects are not as good as they need to be, all other organ systems are going to suffer. You're going to have difficulty improving your foundational science concept application because you cannot apply what you don't know. So what would I ask this student to do if this was my student? Well, this is my student. What did I ask this student to do? Or what will I focus on if I were this student? General principles is 14% of your exam, at least according to this report. That's a lot of percentage. Reproductive and endocrine systems are 11 to 12%. And the truth is, these are easy things to fix. Behavioral health and nervous sciences 11%, respiratory 10 to 11 to 12%, blood, hematology, immunology 10%, musculoskeletal 9%. What you would see here is that if you take these subjects I have put in a circle, these areas, if you master these and you do well, let's say you have average, you are going to pass the exam. Even if we rule out what? These parts. Take just this top area alone. Let's consider only the top part. What you'd see is if you do well in these areas, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you're going to actually pass the exam. You're going to perform well on the exam. You get above a 200. You would even get a 220 if you don't take time, if you know these areas properly. So every student, especially if you're at this level, you should focus on fixing your general principles. You should focus on fixing endocrinology, behavioral health, basically these subjects that they've given you here. It is not useful to focus on any one system by itself. I had a student again last year that said she had a problem with pathology. I'm sure she's probably watching this, and her result is included here as well. She said she had a problem with pathology, so she got a Robbins textbook and she began reading everything pathology. If you do that, this is what will happen. Your pathology, maybe it's going to improve a little bit, but everything else is going to suffer greatly. If you focus on any one organ system for an extended period, say you take a month, I just want to study pathology for 1 month. At the end of that month, your immunology knowledge will come to almost zero. Your microbiology will suffer. Everything, literally everything else is going to suffer. So that is not a good idea. Focusing on one organ system for too long because you feel like you have a weakness in that area is not a good idea. It is much better that you build each of your subject areas by a bit, and then it adds up to something big. If you focus on one subject area and you try to improve that subject area, everything else is going to suffer, and this one thing is not going to be enough to pull you across the finish line to passing your test. So you want to actually be aware of that. Having said that, notice that pathology is about 50% of questions on your exam. No matter what you study, you have to always ask yourself, how does this apply to a disease condition? Whatever, no matter what it is you're studying, anything you study at all, ask yourself, is there any differential diagnosis associated with this concept? What disease? What could go wrong? How can they ask me about this concept? You're studying and you encounter copper, for example. Why am I thinking of copper? You encounter copper. Let's say copper. You ask yourself, are there any diseases? Are there any differentials associated with copper? And immediately you'll be thinking to yourself, okay, what about Wilson's disease? What about Menkes disease? Right? Okay, excess copper deficiency. You ask yourself questions like this as you go through your books. You don't just read. No. Every time you go through a new concept, you ask yourself, how does this concept tie into a pathology? If you're studying general pathology, for example, and you see hydrostatic pressure or even physiology, the question is, how does hydrostatic pressure tie into a pathology? How does it tie into a disease process? You'll probably be thinking of heart failure, right? Heart failure and pulmonary edema, heart failure and generalized edema, for example, heart failure and ankle edema. When you're not just thinking hydrostatic pressure. I read about hydrostatic pressure, so I know what hydrostatic pressure is. Do you know how hydrostatic pressure ties into pathology? That is what is important. Everything must tie into pathology. A lot of people emphasize physiology, but I look at physiology as pathophysiology. So instead of thinking physiology, I like to think pathophysiology. Why? Because on the exam, they are very likely to ask you about physiology as it ties into pathology. They will ask you about physiology as it ties into pathology. They won't just ask you about those things you read about physiology, those calculations in renal system, for example. I've seen students stressed over simple things like that. Oh, I need to memorize the calculation for creatinine. How do I do you? It's not necessary. How does it tie into pathology? That is the focus of the exam. So you want to pay attention to things like this as you study. The next thing is pharmacology. If you have a problem with pharmacology, you have a problem figuring out what medications you need to treat XYZ disease, go study general pharmacology. A lot of students ignore general pharmacology. You feel like autonomic nervous system is a waste of time, or it's just too much information. You really don't want to handle that right now. I will tell you this. If you don't understand general pharmacology, if you don't know what alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, beta 2, beta 3, M1, M2 receptors are, if you don't know the difference between those receptors and how they interact with each other, you're going to have a problem understanding the pharmacology for each of the individual systems. You will just memorize your way through. You will just memorize all the pharmacology. But if you understand receptor interaction, you will find it easy to actually know what pharmacology is talking about. Maybe you have a problem memorizing the names of drugs, which is something you're going to get used to over time. These three subjects, pathology is almost 50%, physiology is 20+%, pharmacology is almost 20%. These three areas, I call them the 3 Ps. Again, physiology, I think of it as pathophysiology. The 3 Ps that will make you pass the USMLE. Fix your pathology, understand pathophysiology, how the pathology interacts with physiology, not just reading physiology, and then understand pharmacology. If you're doing step 2, it's even much easier because you just know the drug of choice, how you treat this, what comes before what. You don't have to learn mechanism of action. If you're doing step 1, however, you want to know the mechanism of action. Good thing they've actually removed a lot of calculations from general pharmacology, so you don't have that to worry about anymore. Emphasize mechanism of action of medications and side effects. Mechanism of action of medications and side effects. If you're able to do this every single time you study, you think of a disease, a disorder, for example, and you ask yourself, what's the treatment for XYZ? Think of something like Ogilvy syndrome is step 2. But even if you're doing step 2 CK, Ogilvy syndrome, you're asking yourself, what's the therapeutic requirement? How do you treat this disease? Why do you use that medication to treat this disease? Right? And Ogilvy syndrome you treat with neostigmine for any step 2 student watching. But why do you use that medication is the question. How does this medication affect the disease? You're going to begin to understand these patterns. And if you can do that, your results or your score is going to improve significantly. Pathology, pathophysiology, and pharmacology. Biochemistry can be daunting for a lot of students. So I don't usually stress students on biochemistry. I let you study biochemistry eventually, but if your pathology is good and your pathophys is good, your pharmacology is good, most of these things actually tie into biochemistry. And when you study biochemistry, the same thing. Don't study biochemistry memorizing pathways. Study biochemistry as it integrates into pathology. That way, again, you will be making your pathology better when you study biochemistry. Anatomy is not the most important thing on the exam. Microbiology, immunology is very important. If you ask me, microbiology you should spend some time doing and all of that. Histology and cell biology. Should you focus your energy learning histology? Simple answer, no. As you study through the systems, as you study through the organ systems, you learn the histology as you learn the pathology. So you should know what a granuloma looks like. When you study TB or you study chronic inflammation, you will learn what a granuloma is. And then at that juncture, you should also look up what granulomas look like. If you see one picture of a granuloma, for example, you want to go online and look for other pictures of what a granuloma is. And then look at many granuloma pictures until you know what a granuloma looks like. Because on your exam, they will not give you the image in the first aid, right? What should you focus on? Again, pathology, pathophysiology, pharmacology. That is what this student will need to work on. Once again, notice something. Even if pathology is high, it is actually low compared to the group. Even if microbiology and immunology is high, it's actually low compared to the group. So a student like this, and if your result looks like this one, you basically need to work on just about everything. But if you don't have time, make sure that you're working on these top things: pathology, pathophysiology, and pharmacology. And that is that for this particular result. Again, this result is very poor. 179 is pretty low. And we would go to a higher result, a student in the 200s, and we are going to see what you need to do differently if you're scoring 200 versus if you're scoring 179. And then, of course, we'll look at what you could do if you're scoring in the 260s as well. Now, this is a student with a 215. This is your regular NBME result. This is what it's going to look like if you go online and just write an NBME for yourself. 215 was pretty good for her, and then you see her array of scores. So she's actually sort of improved progressively from before I met her, and then we started working together, and then you see where she went with that. Now, when you look at this student's performance, similar to the last result we saw, same, this is low, but ultimately we don't really care. It's easy to look at this result and think, oh, applying foundational concepts and diagnosis is actually good. It's better than evidence-based medicine. No, it doesn't really matter. All of this does not matter because everything here indicates that your performance is generally low. This part here, this column only shows you that, well, although all your performance generally is poor, you're actually much worse when it comes to evidence-based medicine. But then this is just 6.6%. So once again, foundational concepts, 75% of your exam, making diagnosis, 25% of the exam, and really the exam is done. So if you fix those two things, in fact, if you know the basics, you have already done more than 50%, 60% of the work. That is what this tells you. If you can apply concepts properly, which once again stems from your understanding of general principles, if you can apply concepts correctly, you will pass the test because you have already done more than 50, 60, almost 70% of the work. Then we go straight to performance aspect of this. Beautiful. Now look at the student's result. Everything here says same. Her knowledge of general principles is just as good as her knowledge of reproductive system, or so it seems. Her knowledge of general principles is just as good as her knowledge of what? Musculoskeletal system, or hematology, for example, or even gastroenterology. That is what this column is telling her. So how does she know what she's supposed to work on? How do you know what you should focus on to improve your score? Now you begin to compare yourself to the group. Even if it looks like you have equal knowledge, equal understanding of most of these subjects, how do you know what your weak areas are? You compare yourself to the group, to everybody else. Once again, when you compare yourself to everybody else, you see that the general principles is weak here, which is very easily reflected up here in the application of foundational science concepts. You can't apply what you don't know. Once again, general principles are the most important aspect of your preparation for the USMLE. In fact, if your general principle is weak, you can manage to pass like she did. The problem is if you don't work on it, step 2 CK is going to be also difficult for you because it's going to take you longer to catch up with a lot of things. So general principles, she needs to work on her general principles. If this was, well, this was my student, if this was your result, you would need to work on general principles. That is the most important. That is the first thing. But everything else is pretty much average. Hematology for this student looks like it's suffering. So I will take note of that. Hematology. I would look at what's this? Musculoskeletal and dermatology. Those will become important areas that she may want to pay attention to. And then we come to biostatistics. Now, notice something. Even if she has equivalent strength in all these other areas, what you would notice here is that she's weak in biostatistics, both relative to her own understanding of other subjects and compared to the group. A lot of students have problems with biostatistics, and you watching me right now, you may also think that, oh, biostatistics is actually a problem. However, this is one of the easiest parts of your exam to fix. A lot of students forget about biostatistics. I know a lot of persons have told you to forget about it. You're going to study, just study it at the end. Let it be the last thing you do. But that often hurts you more than it's going to help you, right? So you want to bear that in mind. Biostatistics is the one area, this 6.6%, you can easily get all those points if you work on biostatistics, and you can do that in less than a few days. 3 subjects I would recommend for this student to work on really quickly. Then we come to this aspect. Actually, I'll tell you something about this student because she shared her story with me. She felt like she was not doing well in pathology. This was the student I was talking about. So she got the Robbins textbook. She got, I don't know, I think a video resource or something, and she began to study pathology. But after she studied pathology to that extent for a long period of time, she did not improve. Why did she not improve? Again, if you need to work on hematology, for example, and you take a long period of time studying only hematology so that you become perfect with hematology, when you come back, dermatology would have gotten twice as bad as it was. General principles would have become twice as bad as they were. So you need to find a balanced approach to studying these things. Take not more than a week, 2 weeks on any given subject area if you must, and finish it and quickly transition to other ones. And you want to also take time in between. If you're studying any organ system, you have to find a way that that organ system connects to other subjects. You want to find the connection between the systems, which is what we call integration. And that reminds me, come sometime in February, probably starting from next week, we are going to be looking at rapid review. So I've finally figured out the setup I would like to be using, and I'm going to be having extended periods of sessions with you guys where I'll just go through rapid review. Rapid review is one of the ways I used to present prepare students for NBMEs back then. I've since stopped for some reason, but it's still very useful and very effective, and it teaches you how to actually begin to see connections between organ systems. So if you're not subscribed to this channel, this is a good time to do so. Hit the like button down below, subscribe, and make sure you turn on notifications so you are aware when videos on that begin to come out. Back to this. Notice this: her knowledge of pathology, physiology, pharmacology all look the same. It's all average. You are as good in pathology as you are in physiology. How does she compare to the group? Pathology is poor. Physiology, which I would call pathophysiology, is poor. But look at this. Pharmacology is fair, right? Microbiology is high, but it's still average compared to the group. This is poor. Histology is poor. Is poor. I wouldn't stress about histology at all. Once again, as you study the organ systems, you look at the histologies associated with them. Don't go pick up a histology book trying to fix histology. That is the easiest way to waste your time on this exam. But I would say that she did pretty good on this NBME compared to other NBMEs. She should certainly look at biochemistry, for example. She should certainly work on general principles and begin to look at how to diagnose patients. The good thing is that this student has written her USMLE already, and she actually appreciated the ability to see what was going on in most of these vignettes. She could interpret the questions, she could think, she was learning how to think, and she's going to use that knowledge and transition into her preparation for the step 2 CK. So once again, when you look at your NBME results, you want to be asking yourself, how do I compare to the group? Do I really need to work on this area, or should I not care? If you are scoring in the low 200s, then you need to say, okay, if this, should I focus on what? Fixing pharmacology? Is there a way I can make pharmacology become high? And this is what I do with some students. Should we focus on making pharmacology high? Maybe making pathology average, because you're not going to get everything perfectly. So what is the best thing to do? Can we get pathology to become average? Can we make pharmacology high? Can we try to get physiology to average? Really, again, I would call this pathophysiology. Can we get physiology to become average? Can we look for a way to make microbiology high? Because microbiology is easy to fix. If we pick these 4 areas, we can decide, okay, you know what? I'm going to work on pathology, which is really, I would focus on general principles here. I'm going to work on pharmacology. I'm going to try to get it to become high, basically, because you're already doing well with pharmacology. It's easy to make it become a strong point. And then I'm going to see how I can make microbiology high as well. If you improve these 3 subject areas, for example, you would have made significant progress. Behavioral sciences are also another easy place to improve. Is there a way I can improve my knowledge of behavioral science? Why is it easy? Biostatistics is always going to be biostatistics. The same things they ask is the same things they ask every time. So if you practice biostatistics and if you know what you're looking for, you can easily improve your biostatistics. These 4 areas for this specific student with this kind of NBME result are going to be areas she should focus on to improve her scores quickly. If you're scoring like 179 like the previous student we saw, then you have more areas you need to focus on and you need to work on all those areas. Should she go ahead trying to improve biochemistry? It depends on how long she has before the exam. I may just be like, okay, you know what, biochemistry, we are going to forget about biochemistry for now. We are going to go through these areas first. When we fix them, we can come back to biochemistry and try to see what we do with biochemistry, especially if you have limited time. If you have all the time in the world, work on every single organ system and you could potentially get them right. With that said, let's move on to the last NBME result. All right, and finally we get to the last NBME we are going to be looking at. This NBME I wrote in December when one of my students was going to write an NBME, and I don't know, she was sort of anxious. And she said, are you going to write one as well while I write mine? And I said, okay. Absolutely. So I woke up the next morning very early before any of my classes and decided to take an NBME myself. Also, I wanted to take this NBME because I'm currently preparing the test taking mastery. I've been going back and forth with it, trying to make sure that it's as complete as I would like it to be. And so I wanted to have a feel of what the exam actually is in its most current state, so that course is going to be as updated as possible. And that reminds me, you can begin signing up for test taking mastery. It's going to be it's a course that basically is going to teach you how to answer questions accurately, how to think, how to actually study to learn for the long term, not just read and forget, but how to study properly in preparation for both the USMLE Step 1 and Step 2 CK alike. You're going to see the link below. Go on the website, sign up so that you'll be one of the very first people to know when it releases very soon. All right, let's jump right into this result. This will be a good score. If a student scores a 264, I would say, well, you've done very well. You should probably go and write your exam already, although now you're not going to score 264 except on Step 2 CK. When you look at this result, you're going to, again, see a pattern. What you notice as you begin to go to the higher ranges of the NBMEs is, even though they tell me this, somebody can look at this and say, oh, your level of your ability to make diagnosis is very high, but your ability to apply science concepts is, it's just there. Now you begin to see the dichotomy that even if this looks like it's not a strong point, it's actually on the high side when you compare it to the group as a whole. And of course, diagnosis is high, and it's high when compared to the group. So again, you're not just comparing yourself to yourself. You don't want to look at your result and say, oh, I did well, this one is high, so that must be great. You want to also say, how do I compare with the group? The higher your score is, the more likely that you are going to also rate or rank higher when compared to the rest of the group. So although my ability to apply foundational concepts is just there, what you notice is it's still high compared to the average student that writes the USMLE. When we begin to look at these things organ system by organ system, what you're going to notice is that all of these subjects are basically the same. So my understanding of them, my strength in them is basically the same, equivalent sort of. But when you compare them to the group, you would notice that they all fall, most of them fall on the high side, meaning my understanding of these concepts compared to the average student is actually very high. But that just makes sense given that the result is a 264. Now look at cardiovascular system. Although I would say my cardiovascular system is weak, actually what happened here was I failed, I think, 2 cardio questions. I missed 2 cardio questions when I was doing this test. And if you look at the questions I missed, you would actually laugh because it's just ridiculous. And that puts me on average for cardiovascular system. And I think I missed 1 respiratory system question as well, and 2 questions on biostatistics. Now, if you score a 264, I see people with 250s on Facebook group always ask, what should I do to improve? You just need to be a little more cautious. That's it. If you're scoring in your 250s and in your 260s, the problem is not that you don't know the material. You're not trying to say, oh, what do I do to strengthen this subject? No. Generally, these subjects are strong. The likely reason is that you did not pay attention enough. For example, when I wrote this NBME, the contingency was that I have to do every block in not more than 30 minutes. So I was not trying to get the questions right. I was trying to see how quickly and how efficiently I could actually answer the question. It's part of the things you should be doing in preparation. There, at a point when you've actually studied and studied and studied and studied, you begin to train yourself for time, begin to train yourself for speed. There are a lot of you out there, a lot of students that you understand the material, but the problem is you take too long to think. You take too long to produce information. You take too long to read through a question. You spend 40 seconds reading a question, and then you spend another 50 seconds trying to figure out what the answer is. You reread the question. So those are one of the exercises I do sometimes when I write these tests. I try to say, okay, I need to do every question in less than a minute. And if it's 50 questions per block, if you do every one of them in less than a minute, or even 30, 40 seconds for each question, you will be moving so quickly. I wouldn't encourage you to try to do every block under 30 minutes. It's not necessary to do that. I just did it because it's fun. But when you rush like that, you make mistakes. On your exam, you want to be able to find a balance. You want to be able to sit down and go, okay, I'm going to pace myself. I'm going to be quick, but at the same time, I'm not going to be rushing through the questions. And the only way you can prepare for this scenario is that you begin to practice it during your study time. Don't relax and take all the time in the world to think about questions and answers, and just because it's going to show on your exam, right? When they give you an actual test in a testing environment under pressure, if you've not trained yourself to actually pace up faster, you're going to find that you run into problems. And my speed, of course, cost me a few questions on this particular test. I'm not really upset about it. It's just interesting to see. Look at this. Relative to all my subjects, physiology is poor. The question someone is going to ask, what am I going to do about it? Am I going to go and study physiology? The answer is no, right? Why? Look at this. It actually is high when compared to the group. Again, I think I missed 1 or 2 questions related to physiology, but even what I consider low for me relative compared to every other subject, what you'd see is that it's still high compared to the group. And this is what you want to see. If you have scores that you think they're not very high. You want to see how you compare to the group, and that should be the emphasis almost all the time you do the NBME. If you're scoring in the 260s, you should be going for efficiency. You probably shouldn't spend a lot of time trying to study. That's just ridiculous. You should start thinking of how to answer the questions in faster time, because ultimately you have to remember that the USMLE is going to be much longer than any NBME you've written. Your NBMEs are 4 blocks. The USMLE is going to be 7 hours long. So how is fatigue going to affect your performance? Are you still going to score a 260 if the exam is 3 hours versus if the exam is 7 hours? You want to start building and developing those aspects of your preparation. And that's what I would encourage anybody in the 250s and 260s to do. Reading is not your problem. Efficiency is what you should focus on. Time management, speed, accuracy. You don't want to make mistakes like me. You don't want to blunder questions like I do. But of course, I was deliberately rushing. I was trying to give myself a little handicap while doing this exam, but it was fun. And that brings us to the end of this video. I have finally figured out what to do with my YouTube channel, guys. For the longest time I've been trying to think about what interface I want to use, how do I organize these videos before I release them. And of course, I've been very, very busy with students as well. But from now going forward, I think I figured out what I need to do. Make sure you subscribe down below. Give this video a thumbs up if you liked it. Let me know what your biggest challenge is down there and what you would like me to talk about going forward. We are going to begin a series, rapid review series on this channel. You're just going to see me pick up rapid review, what you have behind your first aid, and break it down, elaborate on it, and show you how to integrate, how to think, how to learn, and how to actually begin to look at the USMLE differently. And I can guarantee that you're going to realize that this exam is actually way more easier than you ever thought it was. Thanks again for watching this video. It's been so long, and I will see you guys on the next one.